advanced processes. This particular mead here is the one that I made for my master's tutorial. It's 8 months old. It's made with 4 pounds of honey. Now your mileage may vary on that. I know Brother Maynard has made a mead with that tutorial, and it didn't necessarily come out the same as this one, but this one is very sweet. If you're going to be making mead for sharing, other Belgium tend to like their drinks to taste like Kool-Aid in my experience. So on the sweeter side is a good way to go if you want to be sharing. Very tasty. A little dollop of history. Mead predates the written word. It's about as old, or if not a little bit older, than grape wine, as far as how long people have been making it. Probably how it got discovered was there was an old beehive in the trunk of a hollow tree that got rainwater in it, and some pre-human dude in the continent of Africa, maybe, was looking for water, and he found this water honey mixture, and it got him a little buzzed, and he was like, "Ooh, that's tasty. I think I'll have some more." Grape wine may have come around a little later during the agricultural revolution, but we're not sure. And beer almost certainly came after the agricultural revolution, because you have to harvest a bunch of wheat to make beer. So if you ask me, mead's the oldest alcoholic beverage there is. So in 60 Common Era, Columella, the Spanish Roman, wrote down a recipe for making mead. Take some old water, mix a little bit of this water with a pound of honey. For a weaker mead, mix some water with a little less honey. Then the whole thing is exposed to the sun for 40 days and left on a shelf near the fire. If you have no rainwater, then boil spring water. And that's the whole ancient recipe for making mead. One thing that is missing from this recipe that we now know, thanks to Louis Pasteur, is yeast. If you're going to be making mead, you need to add a yeast. How did he get around this yeast absence? He used his brewing pot. There has been some cultural anthropology done on the Viking totem stick. That would be the spoon or the stick or the wand that the Vikings used only for brewing and not for other types of cooking or other tasks. And it got the yeast from prior batches, stuck to that stick, and were imparted into the new batch. Almost wine vat, which he called mustum lixivum, would have had the same effect on imparting the yeast from former batches onto the new batch. So that's how brewing in ancient times worked. They just sort of didn't really clean up their brewing pot or their totem stick, and they just got lucky. And some yeast got in there, and it turned their sugar into alcohol. That is how the scientific process of brewing works. The yeast turns the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Is how that works. While I'm sharing my screen, I cannot see the chat. So if anybody's chatting, can I have Leita read out the comments if they're needing to be heard? Or if you have any questions at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and I will answer them as best I can. Are we good to go on?
Well, good.
Okay, thank you. Some glossary of terms. A must is the honey and water mixture before you put in the yeast. To pitch is to add yeast to your honey and water mixture. Sediment formed at the bottom of your brewing vessel, which is composed of dead yeast, is called lees. To rack is to move your mead off the sediment. Primary is your first fermentation vessel. Secondary is your second fermentation vessel. You can do it with just the one vessel by doing an extra transfer. So if you only have one glass carboy, you can take your mead out of the primary, wash your glass, and then put it back in, and it'll be secondary. Specific gravity is the concentration of sugar in a mixture, and the hydrometer is the tool for measuring specific gravity. Here's a picture of my 4 pounds, 2.6 ounces that I put in this 1 gallon batch of mead. Tools and supplies. So this is going to be the modern technique for brewing a mead. We're not going to just stir it with a dirty stick and hope it kicks off. We're going to use yeast, and we're going to use glass and plastic. You need honey, water, yeast, a fermentation vessel. That's really, honestly, all you need. Sanitation technology in an airlock is extremely recommended. I use a commercial brewing sanitizer. You can also use diluted bleach. That works too. The airlock is this little plastic gizmo here that allows the excess carbon dioxide that yeast creates to leave your vessel, and it prevents other nasty bugs and oxygen from getting in. That's what the airlock does. Other things you want: mixing vessel. I used a pot, measuring tools, cup thing. Yeast nutrients are something that are more optional, but yeast nutrients, I got a commercial yeast nutrient here. You could also use grapes. Grapes are a good yeast nutrient. I've done that. If you're doing a show mead with just honey and water, there can be some benefits to using a yeast nutrient. It makes your brew go a little faster and start a little faster and keep going a little better. But might not necessarily need that, but it's cool. Hydrometer for additional science. My hydrometer is inside this case. It's I got a picture of it later on. It's just a floating piece of glass tube that tells you how much sugar is in your. Use other ingredients, now's the time. But we'll talk about the other ingredients later. So what you're going to do is you're going to sanitize everything. Everything that's going to come into contact with any of your ingredients. You can use a commercial brewer's sanitizer or bleach. So I just fill up my sink. I add the necessary amount of sanitizer, and then I dunk everything in the sanitizer according to the instructions. If you're going to use a bleach, you want to rinse off everything after you dunk it in the sanitizer. And we do the sanitization step because we only want our yeast to have access to the sugar. No other nasty bugs might make it taste funny. Then once everything is nice and clean, you can mix your honey in your water. If your honey is crystallized, as mine often is, I buy my honey a lot at a time and just sitting in the cupboard, mix it crystallize, which is fine. That's not a problem. But you need to melt down those crystals. And I do this by putting it with a little bit of water or a lot, however much you want. Just make sure that your total volume will fit inside your brewing vessel. Heating it up very low. This mead here got to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was enough to melt the honey. A good middle ground to start brewing is 3 pounds per gallon. That'll give you a medium a medium mead, and then plus or minus from there will go sweeter or drier. So sweeter mead, it works the same way as wine if you're familiar with sweet versus dry wines. The sweeter mead has more sugar left over after the yeast is done, and a dry mead will have less or no sugar left over. It'll be all converted to alcohol. So that's sweet versus dry. You can and should utilize the entire internet for determining how much honey is in your recipe. There is a mead calculator on Reddit, reddit.com/mead, that I use, and it has all the variables on there. So the variables are what your yeast's alcohol tolerance is, what your amount of honey you want to use, and what your desired alcohol by volume is at the end. So you can fill in one or two of those variables, and the calculator will spit out your other thing. So if I'm using a yeast with an alcohol tolerance of 15, and I want to have an ending alcohol by volume of 14, how much honey do I need? That calculator will tell you. There's also a couple of different types of yeast. They're in order of alcohol tolerance from low to high: bread yeast, ale yeast, wine yeast, and distiller's yeast. I would not use bread yeast. You can, it works. I would not use distiller's yeast. You can, it's not made for that though. The best to use, and I only use, is the wine yeast. Any commercial wine yeast will do. I use the Pasteur Blanc. That's the yellow packet made by Red Star. So I talked a lot about a lot of information on that slide. Any questions about recipes that don't use other ingredients? Talking just honey so far.
There was none in the chat.
Okay. If you heated your honey, let it cool to room temperature, and then you can add your yeast. This picture, I have checked my yeast to make sure it's good. To do that, you just stick it in a little cup with a little bit of water, and like a drop of honey. And if it bubbles up like that, your yeast is still good. The commercial yeasts also come with expiration dates, so you can follow that too. This is the same way that you can check your bread yeast to see if it's good. Stick it in your brewing vessel. This is a 1 gallon vessel. Top with your airlock and wait 6 to 12 months or more. You can wait. There's not really an upper limit on how long your mead is in this vessel, but you need to wait until the bubbles stop before you bottle it. Secondary fermentation is, did I talk about? Oh, there's my yeast slide. Hey, what's after that? That's that. Wait 6 to 12 months or more. So you can do a secondary fermentation, and depending on the yeast you use or your other ingredients, you may want to take your mead off of the sediment and rack it to a secondary vessel. So either just empty this one, put it in a pot to the side or whatever while you wash this one and put it back to get rid of the sediment, or you can use another clean vessel. There can be potential benefits to that, but I have, at one time, I stuck a 5-gallon batch of mead with like 2 cinnamon sticks in it in the linen closet for 2 years, and honestly forgot about it, and that was from the very first slide. That's that mead that turned out just great. So there's probably not an upper limit to how long you can wait. But this airlock gives you a good clue of if it's still fermenting or not. If there are bubbles coming through this airlock, your mead is still fermenting. Once it slows down to about 1 bubble per minute, or less, bottle it. If you bottle it before your mead is done fermenting, your bottles will explode, and that is bad. Ask me how I know. I've done it. There's 4 different kinds of yeast. You can use bread yeast. The bread yeast has a very yeast has a lower alcohol tolerance than wine yeast. Wine yeast is specifically made to taste very tasty. Distiller's yeast has the highest alcohol tolerance, but it's not intended to taste good because you're going to distill whatever you're distilling if you use that. So use the wine yeast. Now, optional but good steps to take your mead to the next level. Before applying your airlock in that slide, before you apply your airlock, you can take an initial gravity reading. This little floating device in this tube is my hydrometer. Once again, specific gravity is the concentration of sugar in your mixture. It takes 2 specific gravity readings to calculate your final alcohol content. So if you want to know what your final alcohol content is, you need to take 2 specific gravity readings, one at the beginning and one at the end, and then do the math to figure out your alcohol by volume. And if you're sharing your mead, everybody wants to know, hey, what's the alcohol content in this? This is how you figure that out, with a hydrometer and 2 measurements. Racking. I've already talked about this. Oh, but there's fruit on this slide. So when the bubbles stop coming out of your airlock or slow to about 1 or less per minute, you can rack your mead off the sediment to a secondary vessel for bulk aging or additional ingredients. We're done talking about the show mead. We're going to start talking about additional ingredients. Secondary is a great time for addition of fruits. I usually put my spices in a primary because the spices don't contain sugar. Tip: freeze your fruit before adding it to your meat. It breaks down the cell walls and lets all the juice and flavor out. I have done meads with fruit in the primary, and what happens is I did an apricot mead, I did a apple, orange. What happens is the yeast eats the sugar from the honey and the fruit, and it gives it a very subtle fruit flavor. If you want a stronger fruit flavor, do it in the second. Yeah, anything that comes from plant, you can brew. Anything you think will taste good. I've done a bunch of different fruit meads. They were all great. If you're gonna do a stone fruit, like anything with a pit, cherry, apricot, peach, anything with fruit. Take the pit out. Pits don't taste good. You can do spices. Anything in your spice rack, you can make a mead out of. I'm a huge sucker for cinnamon, nutmeg, clove. Will help you out there. There are some terms for meads that are made with various ingredients. Make a mead with herbs or spices, it's a metheglin. Make a mead with a fruit, it's a melomel. Make a mead with an apple or apple juice, it's a sizer. Grape or grape juice, it's piment. A grain, it's a braggot. I've had a really tasty braggot made by Sir Kagan at one of the ye old chaos mead tournaments, and it tasted just like a Hefeweizen. So that would be a really cool thing to experiment. You can toast or burn your honey, and it's called a bochet. Give you some kind of marshmallowy, chocolatey type ideas. The very, very first mead I ever tried was at an event, and it was a jalapeno mead. And if you make a mead with spicy peppers, it's called capsicumel, named after the capsaicin in the spicy peppers, which you have to honestly like the spicy peppers in order for that to work, because it is spicy. And I'm not a super huge fan of like jalapenos, really, unless it's wrapped in bacon. But that mead with the jalapenos in it was good, and I knew at that point that I wanted to become a mead maker. That was probably 9 years ago now. That is the end of our slideshow. Do you have any questions or comments about mead making, about brewing, about gear, about recipes, about anything at all? You're so welcome, Anastasia. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sven. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Yeah, we can stop the recording. Cool. All right.
Yeah. In 30 minutes, we have someone else. Leather Watercolor Dye Technique by Squire Master Yzma. So you guys are all welcome to do whatever you want then. If Sven, if Alina wants to hop on,